Thank you, Father, for your introduction. And I hope you all have a handout with you. As you see, there are 2 pages, but in my presentation, I think I'll just focus on the first page. So the first page, I present the problem, and the second page, basically, I present my suggested way out of the problem, but I think I'll leave this part to the Q&A in case you have any questions about it. Okay, so thanks for giving me the chance to talk about the problem I encounter in my doctoral research. So my research is about Aquinas' ground theory of human intellectual cognition that covers how the human intellect works, not just here and now, but also when it is separated, when it is in Christ, in the pre-Lazarian Adam, when it is blessed in heaven. So I try to see this whole ground theory and consider whether this whole ground theory is coherent after several developments in Aquinas' career. So because of my research, I've come to think about this topic about embodiment in heaven. Okay, so let's begin. So first of all, one question. Does embodiment in heaven make philosophical sense? I suppose the standard Thomistic answer is yes, of course. Well, here the answer goes. When we are in heaven, even though we see God face to face, and this vision drastically impacts us, but still, this vision does not change the nature of our soul. Our soul remains the form of a body. So it goes against the nature of our soul if it stays separated forever. And the bodily resurrection will fulfill the nature of our soul. So in a word, given Aquinas' hylomorphic account of human nature, bodily resurrection fulfills our soul's nature. And so the bodily resurrection makes perfect philosophical sense. So basically, I suppose this is the standard Thomistic answer, and it says, yes, it makes sense. But does it? In this presentation, I want to reflect further on this Thomistic answer. I will argue that there is actually a severe tension between Aquinas' hylomorphic account of human nature and his belief in bodily resurrection in heaven. So in this presentation, my primary goal is to articulate the tension, or I call it the incompatibility problem in my handout. So the tension or the problem involves 2 arguments. As you see in the handout, the first argument is argument 1. It goes like this. Premise 1, our corruptible body is for the sake of the human soul. Premise 2, if the body is for the sake of the soul, the body is for the sake of our intellective understanding. Premise 3, if our body is for the sake of our intellective understanding, our body should cognitively contribute to our intellective understanding, and therefore, our body should cognitively contribute to our intellective understanding. As I'll argue below, given Aquinas' teaching in Prima Pars 84.4 and Prima Pars 89.1, Aquinas should take this as a strong philosophical argument for the cognitive contribution of our natural corruptible human body. The problem involves another argument, which is argument 2 on your handout. The argument goes like this. Premise 1 star, our glorified body is for the sake of the blessed human soul. Premise 2 star, if our glorified body is for the sake of the blessed human soul, the glorified body is for the sake of our beatific vision. Premise 3 star, if our glorified body is for the sake of our beatific vision, our glorified body should cognitively contribute to our beatific vision. Therefore, our glorified body should cognitively contribute to our beatific vision. So, well, as I'll show, actually in the Summa Theologiae Prima Secunda, Aquinas denies that the glorified body contributes to the beatific vision in any cognitively significant way. The problem I try to articulate here is precisely that Aquinas cannot consistently uphold argument 1 on the one hand and reject argument 2 on the other hand. Now, so far I've just outlined the problem. So to articulate the problem more fully, I'll have to provide textual evidence to substantiate my claims. So my presentation will be divided into 2 main parts. In the first main part, I'll explain why Aquinas has to accept argument 1, given his teaching mainly in the prima pars. So in the first main part, I'll first talk about an idea that guides Aquinas' thinking of the human soul-body union and the role of the body in our intellectual activities, namely the Aristotelian idea that matter is for the sake of the form. As I will show, in the Summa Prima Pars, this idea shapes the way Aquinas thinks about the cognitive contribution of this worldly, corruptible body. After explaining the idea that matter is for the sake of the form, I'll go through some texts taken from Prima Pars 84.4 and 89.1. In these texts, Aquinas reflects on the contribution of our natural, this worldly, corruptible body to our natural intellectual activities. By natural intellectual activities, I mean our intellectual activities that are not graced, not elevated, so in a word, not supernatural. So when I go through these texts, I'll identify the implications Aquinas draws from the idea that matter is for the sake of the form in these texts. By seeing the implications he draws, we see why Aquinas has to accept argument 1, given his teaching in these texts. In the second part, I'll first show you how Aquinas applies the idea that matter is for the sake of the form to our glorified body and our beatific vision in Compendium Theologiae. The compendium text I'll give you will show that Aquinas accepts the first two premises of argument 2. After discussing the compendium text, I will turn back to the Summa Prima Secunda, question 4, article 5. I'll show that Aquinas himself actually rejects the third premise of argument 2, and then I'll argue that Aquinas cannot consistently reject that premise without undermining argument 1. So let's proceed to the first part. What does it mean to say that matter is for the sake of the form? In Aquinas' physics commentary, Aquinas illustrates the idea as follows, as you can see the text on the screen. For matter is for the sake of the form, and form is from the agent for the sake of the end, unless it itself is the end. For example, we say that a saw has teeth in order to cut, and these teeth ought to be made of iron, so they will be aid for cutting, end quote. Here, Aquinas illustrates the idea very briefly by the example of a saw. Okay, we are all familiar with this tool. The saw has a certain form. For example, it has teeth, okay, which is for the sake of cutting. In order to cut, Aquinas says, the teeth, quote, ought to be made of iron, end quote. To see the idea and the example more fully, we can consider another passage from the physics commentary. But actually, the saw example comes from Aristotle, Physics, Book 2, Chapter 9. And we see Aquinas illustrating the idea more fully when he comments on the relevant passage in Physics 2.9. There, Aquinas says, quote, the things made or generated are so disposed because of the end. And the material principles seek to be aped for this disposition that the end requires, as is clear in a saw. For a saw is this way, it's not very fluent English translation anyway. It's this way, that is, has a certain disposition or form, and for this reason, it must have such a matter. And it has this disposition or form because of some end. However, this end, which is cutting, could not be achieved unless the saw were of iron. Therefore, I emphasize, it is necessary that a saw be iron if there must be a saw, and it must be for this end, which is its operation. So, based on these two texts from the physics commentary, we see that matter is for the sake of the form basically means the following. It means that a hylomorphic compound has its specific material principle because the compound needs that material principle to have the disposition or form that its function requires. So a thing serves certain function so that it must have a certain form, it must have certain features, disposition, and therefore it must be made of or realized by the right matter, the right material principle. So in the case of a saw, it is for cutting, so it must have sharp teeth, and therefore it must be made of a hard material like iron, steel, and absolutely definitely not mascarpone, not butter. Okay. So for Aquinas, the idea that matter is for the sake of the form applies also to human beings. But the idea needs some adjustment to be applicable. Now let's take a look at a quote from Prima Pars 84:4. So in this article, Aquinas rejects Avicenna and Plato's view that our intellect naturally understands things by directly receiving an influx from a certain separated form, such as the Platonic idea or the Avicennian active intellect. So Aquinas rejects this view for the following reason. Quote, given this position, no sufficient reason can be given for why our soul is united with the body. For one cannot claim that the intellective soul is united with the body for the sake of the body, since it is not the case that form exists for the sake of matter or that what effects movement exists for the sake of the thing moved. In fact, just the opposite is true. Now, given that the soul does not depend on the body with respect to its essay or its being, the body seems necessary to the intellective soul, mainly for the soul's proper operation, that is, intellective understanding. But, I emphasize, if the soul were of its nature able to receive intelligible species only through the influence of separated principles and did not take them from the sensory powers, then it would not need the body in order to have intellective understanding, and its union with the body would be pointless. So the first thing I would add is that I'm not going to comment on whether this argument is a successful objection against Avicenna, because we have a great expert here. But I want you to pay attention to this. See what Aquinas is trying to say. He's saying matter is for the sake of the form, therefore the body is for the sake of the soul. Now, we are already familiar with the idea that matter is for the sake of the form. It means that a hylomorphic compound has its material principle because of its end. Now, in the case of a saw, its end is its function to cut. Now, what is the end in the case of human beings? Now, Aquinas is quite explicit here in this text. Aquinas says, the end is its proper operation to understand. Now, if the body is for the sake of our intellectual understanding, Aquinas infers here, it means that we should take the intelligible species from the sensory powers. So now we see what implication Aquinas draws from the idea that matter is for the sake of the form here in this text. Our natural corruptible body is for the sake of our intellective understanding. So our senses should contribute to our intellective understanding. At least it must have such contribution in our natural embodied understanding. So now let's turn to another text. So Prima Pars 89:1. Now for Aquinas, the idea that matter is for the sake of the form further implies that our intellect's optimal natural function needs our natural corruptible body. Now, my presentation cannot cover the whole 89.1. I can only highlight 2 points here. First, in this article, Aquinas appeals to the idea that matter is for the sake of the form to dismiss the Platonic account of separated soul's natural condition. As he says, I quote, on the Platonic view, the soul would not be united to its body for the soul's own good, given that its intellective understanding would be poorer when it is united with the body than when it is separated. Instead, the union would be solely for the sake of the betterment of the body. But this is ludicrous, since matter is for the sake of the form and not vice versa. End quote. So for Aquinas, matter is for the sake of the form, so the body should be for the soul's own good. That is why the Platonic view that embodiment makes our intellective understanding poorer must be ruled out. What does it mean for the body to be for the soul's own good? Now, this question leads to my second point. Aquinas insists in this article that our body should somehow make our intellective understanding better. He insists the embodied mode of understanding and the disembodied mode are not equally good. They are not good in incommensurable ways so that we cannot compare them. Rather, he says the following, quote, if human souls had been constituted by God in such a way as to have intellective understanding in the mode in which separated substances have it, then they would not have had perfect cognition, but would instead have had indistinct cognition in general. So in Latin, we are familiar with these terms now, sed confusam in commune. Therefore, in order for them to be able to have perfect and proper cognition of things, they were naturally constituted in such a way as to be united to bodies and so to receive their proper cognition of sensible things from the things themselves. So then, it is clear that it is for the soul's own good that it should be united to a body and have intellective cognition by turning itself towards phantasms, and yet the soul is able to be separated and to have a different mode of intellective understanding. End quote. So, in a word, Aquinas insists that our intellect's optimal function, or in his work, the perfect cognition of things, needs the body. Thus, when applying the idea that matter is for the sake of the form to our natural intellectual activity and to our natural corruptible body, Aquinas ends up holding that our body cognitively improves our intellective activities in some way, such that we need our body to have perfect and proper cognition of things. So far, we have gone through what Aquinas means by matter is for the sake of the form, and we have seen how he applies the idea to our corruptible body and to our natural intellectual activities. So now I hope it's clear that Aquinas would endorse argument 1, as you see on a handout. So I'll recap it. Premise 1, our corruptible body is for the sake of the human soul. If our body is for the sake of the human soul, the body is for the sake of our intellective understanding. If our body is for the sake of our intellective understanding, our body should cognitively contribute to our intellective understanding. Therefore, our body should cognitively contribute to our intellective understanding. Now, premise 1 and 2 are true precisely because matter is for the sake of the form. As for premise 3, this is a premise Aquinas cannot consistently deny given his teaching in Prima Pars 89.1. So now, let's move on to the second main part, and let's talk about the glorified body and the beatific vision. Now, Aquinas holds that the glorified body and the blessed soul form a hylomorphic compound. Not surprisingly, he thinks that the glorified body is for the sake of the blessed soul. This can be seen in the following quote from the Compendium, Book 1, Chapter 167. So again, this is a pretty long quote. So, quote, and because the body is for the sake of the soul, as matter is for the sake of the form, and a tool for the sake of a craftsman, God in the resurrection will unite to the soul that will obtain the aforementioned blessed life, the kind of body that befits the soul's happiness. For means for the sake of an end should be disposed according to what the end requires, and it does not belong to a soul reaching the height of intellectual activity to have a body that impedes or retards the soul to any degree. But the human body, by reason of its corruptibility, impedes and retards the soul, so that the soul can neither remain continually in contemplation nor arrive at the height of contemplation. Therefore, the bodies of the blessed who rise will be incorruptible and completely obedient to the soul, so that their bodies do not resist the soul in anything, and will not be corruptible and retarding the soul as is the case now. End quote. For Aquinas, matter is for the sake of the form, So when we are in heaven, we should have a body befitting our soul's happiness, which consists in the beatific vision, as Aquinas argues in the Compendium Theologiae, chapter 106. Since the glorified body is for the sake of the beatific vision, which he calls contemplation or intellectual activity in this text here, Aquinas infers that this body must be incorruptible. Now, I've not explained everything in this text, but I hope this text makes it clear that Aquinas explicitly accepts the first two premises of argument 2, namely, premise 1 star, our glorified body is for the sake of the blessed human soul, and premise 2 star, if the glorified body is for the sake of the blessed human soul, our glorified body is for the sake of the beatific vision, so that, Aquinas thinks, the body does not impede the vision. So, for Aquinas, the glorified body is for the sake of the beatific vision. Now, even if the glorified body is somehow for the sake of the beatific vision, what does it imply to say that the glorified body is for the beatific vision? Does it imply that the bodily resurrection will grant us, let's say, a more comprehensive, a clearer beatific vision? Now, in this text, Aquinas only says that the glorified body should not impede the vision. Well, then, is the whole point of bodily resurrection simply not to impede the vision or the soul? Now, if it was Aquinas' view, then Aquinas' view would be pretty odd. At any rate, by definition, a separated soul doesn't have a body. So obviously, it doesn't have a body that impedes the soul. So if the whole point of bodily resurrection is simply to give us a body that does not impede the soul, then the bodily resurrection seems pointless. Aquinas must attribute a more positive role to the glorified body. And in fact, Aquinas does think that the glorified body have something more positive to contribute to the beatific vision, but the contribution is not conative. Now, the first question, why is the contribution not conative? Now, Aquinas' answer can be found in Prima Secunda 4.5, where he argues that one can be blessed without the body. So let's take a look at the text. Quote, for the intellect needs the body for its operation only because of the phantasms in which it perceives intelligible truths. This was explained in the Prima Pars, but as was also explained in the Prima Pars, it is obvious that God's essence cannot be seen through phantasms. Hence, since man's perfect beatitude consists in seeing God's essence, man's perfect beatitude does not depend on the body, and so the soul can be blessed without the body. So the point relevant to our discussion here is this. If the body can contribute cognitively, it is because of the phantasms. But in this case, the phantasms cannot help. So the body cannot contribute anything cognitively. Now, but then the next question is, if it cannot contribute anything cognitively significant, what positive role does Aquinas assign to the glorified body? Again, Aquinas' answer can be found in the same article. So he says this. There are two ways in which something pertains to a thing's perfection. The first way is by constituting that thing's essence in the way that the soul is required for man's perfection. In the second way, what is required for the thing's perfection is what pertains to this well-being, or this bene esse, in the way that bodily attractiveness or quickness of wit pertains to the man's perfection. Therefore, even though the body is irrelevant to the perfection of the human beatitude in the first way, it is nonetheless relevant in the second way. For since a thing's operation depends on its nature, when the soul is more perfect in its own nature, it will to that extent have more perfectly the proper operation in which happiness consists. So what is Aquinas saying here? I think what he's saying is this. First, when the blessed soul is united with the glorified body, Aquinas says, the soul is more perfect in its own nature. So I guess many of you would think of it this way. The soul is finally a complete person, a complete human person. And accordingly, Aquinas says, the soul should have more perfectly the proper operation in which happiness consists. So this operation can be nothing but the beatific vision. That is, when the soul is embodied, the blessed soul should have the beatific vision more perfectly. Now, but how can the blessed soul have it more perfectly with the body? Aquinas says, there are two ways in which something pertains to a thing's perfection. One, it pertains to the essence of the perfection. Two, it pertains to the well-being or the bene esse of the perfection. Now Aquinas says that the body is irrelevant to the perfection of the human beatitude in the first way. Presumably, this is because phantasms cannot help us see God any better in the beatific vision. Therefore, what is left to Aquinas is the second option. And Aquinas affirms without much elaboration that the body contributes to the bene esse of the operation, roughly in a way that a handsome face contributes to the perfection of a man. Now, more can be said about this text, but I believe I've said enough to show that Aquinas actually rejects the third premise of argument 2, namely, 3 star, if our glorified body is for the sake of our beatific vision, our body should cognitively contribute to our beatific vision. Now, given what Aquinas says in the compendium text and the Prima Secunda 4.5, what Aquinas really holds is that, well, our glorified body is for the sake of the beatific vision, but the body contributes only in a non-cognitive way, whatever it is precisely. So now, let's take a look at argument 1 and argument 2 again. As I argued, Aquinas would accept argument 1. However, I've also pointed out that Aquinas would reject premise 3 of argument 2. So what's the problem? Now the problem is this. Let's consider the third premise of argument 1 and argument 2 together. Premise 3 of argument 1, if our corruptible body is for the sake of our intellective understanding, our body should cognitively contribute to our intellective understanding. 3 star of argument 2, if our glorified body is for the sake of our beatific vision, our body should cognitively contribute to our beatific vision. Now, Aquinas thinks that 3 is true, but 3 star is false. Now, recall that in Prima Pars 89.1, Aquinas insists that the body should be for the soul's own good, and so he insists that the optimal function or the perfect cognition of things of the human intellect needs the body. And that's why I attribute premise 3 to Aquinas. But now, Aquinas' rejection of 3 star actually gives us a reason to call premise 3 of argument 1 into question. Why think that in one case, the body is for the soul's own good only if the soul's perfect cognition needs the body, but in the other case, it doesn't imply that? Why is there such a difference? Now, if we put aside Aquinas' view of the glorified body, okay, we ignore argument 2 and the glorified body thing for the moment. Perhaps Aquinas could argue that premise 3 is true because our natural corruptible body should cognitively contribute to our natural intellectual cognition based on the following intuitive claim. On your handout, claim I. Can you find that? Okay, so roughly it goes like this. Conceptually, if something X is for the sake of an operation O and O's existence does not depend on X, then X facilitates O to attain the good O's aims at. Now, this is a pretty rough statement, and I won't be surprised if some of you can figure out some counterexample and say that this claim needs some refinement. But I just want to make a point like this. So at first, the first point, at least the claim I sounds somewhat intuitive to me. So think of my glasses. So we create glasses for the sake of our eyesight in the sense that without the glasses, I cannot see very clearly, but with the glasses, I see much better. Okay? But of course, I don't need my glasses to have my eyesight. So similarly, If the corruptible body is for the sake of our soul's intellective understanding, then the body should help us understand better. Now, Aquinas cannot appeal to I to justify premise 3 of argument 1, since just suppose I is true and I really helps to justify premise 3, then it should also justify premise 3 star, so that the glorified body should help our intellect see better in the beatific vision. But it means that the glorified body contributes cognitively to the beatific vision, contrary to what Aquinas explicitly says. As we have seen, Aquinas thinks that his view of the glorified body is based on reason, namely, phantasms cannot help us see God. So, Aquinas' view of the glorified body requires him to reject I in this case, assuming that I can really justify premise 3. But if we reject I, it's not clear why premise 3 of argument 1 holds, and it's not clear why Aquinas can reasonably hold that our corruptible body cognitively contribute to our intellect's natural operation, as he claims in Prima Pars 89.1. Now here you may ask, well, does premise 3 really need a justifying reason? Can we just take it as probably basic, for example? Well, my answer is, it does need a justification. Why? This is because Aquinas needs a justification to reject the Platonic view. Suppose a Platonist raises the objection like this. Why think that our perfect cognition needs the body? Aquinas' view of the glorified body makes clear that the body does not have to contribute to our intellectual operation to make sense of the glorified soul-body union. Why can't we just hold that our natural soul-body union makes sense, but the body contributes to the soul only in a non-cognitive ways? Without a plausible justification of premise 3, Aquinas has no good answer to this Platonist, and he has no good reason to uphold his position in Prima Pars 89.1. So in other words, Aquinas faces a dilemma. If he accepts I, then his view of the glorified body is false. If he rejects I, then his view of the separated soul is unwarranted, or at least its justification is unclear. So now we have seen that Aquinas faces a dilemma, and the task of articulating the tension or the incompatibility problem is basically done. So now we can step back and see where the problem really lies. My view, the problem lies precisely in the idea that matter is for the sake of the form. Aquinas draws very different implications from the idea in different cases without being explicit about how to determine or identify the right implication in each case. As it turns out, these different implications clash. Since the idea that matter is for the sake of the form is part and parcel of Aquinas' hylomorphic account of human nature, we have seen a clash between Aquinas' hylomorphic account of human nature and his belief in bodily resurrection in heaven. So now, let's sum up what I've presented so far. I've articulated the tension between Aquinas' hylomorphic account of human nature and his belief in the bodily resurrection in heaven. The problem involves two arguments, argument 1, argument 2. Simply put, there is a problem because if argument 1 is a strong argument against the Platonists, then argument 2 should at least be equally strong against Aquinas' own view. Yet, Aquinas' various teachings imply that he has to uphold argument 1, but he has to reject argument 2. So the problem is, how is it possible to uphold argument 1 as a strong argument against the Platonist view on the one hand, and reject argument 2 to preserve his view of the glorified body on the other hand? So because of some of the discussion last night in the dinner, so I want to add something not in my script. So let's consider one potential solution to my problem. Now, many Thomists, and in fact, I believe Aquinas himself would say that, okay, our soul is not a person, but our soul is a person only when it is embodied. Well, in that case, well, we can say that the soul body, the glorified soul body union makes sense precisely because when the blessed soul has the body back, then the body gives the soul a great good. Namely, it makes the soul becomes a person. Okay, and that's why we can somehow dismiss the argument too. Now, I think there are several problems in this answer. Some of them I'll just highlight very briefly. For one thing, of course, it needs some development to make it clear which premise does it reject. Does it reject premise 2 or 2 star or 3 star? So this is one minor problem. Another minor problem is it is somewhat related. Depending on how you flesh out the objection, I suspect it will somehow go against either the compendium text or the prima secunda text 4.5. But I want to raise a more serious problem, and I think it reveals how tricky the incompatibility problem really is. The thing is, just suppose for the sake of argument that this solution really helps to reject argument 2. Then it seems that it is equally effective to reject argument 1, because a natural separated soul also needs the body to become a person. That's why, in this case, the Platonists can say, well, why think that the body should give us a somewhat better understanding of things with the body? A Platonist can say, well, as you say, Thomas, the body fulfills the nature of the separated soul. So why can't we just say that the soul gets by the body and becomes a person? That's good enough. But still, a separated soul can have a much, much better understanding of things. Why can't a Platonist reject the Thomistic teaching in Prima Pars 89.1 like that? So I think a more serious problem of this suggested solution is that if it is effective in rejecting argument 2, it is equally effective in rejecting argument 1. But the tricky part is that if we really want to defend Aquinas, we have to uphold argument 1 as a strong argument against the Platonists on the one hand, and reject argument 2 on the other hand. So this is the tricky part of the problem. And so my final words. So to my knowledge, so I might be mistaken, but I believe the problem is unresolved. Okay, and the more important question is this resolvable? Now, if it is resolvable, how can we resolve it? If it is not resolvable, how should we deal with it? At the moment, I must admit I don't have a settled answer. Well, I can only tell you I tend to think that the best way to deal with this problem is basically to bite the bullet, accept argument 2, and refine Aquinas' view accordingly. So that's basically what I say on page 2 of the handout. But instead of presenting my suggested refinements, I think I would like to stop here and hear your thoughts and see whether you have more ideas for me to resolve the problem. So because, as the Fries often say in Aquinas 101, it matters what you think. Thank you.